Waiter helps paraplegic elderly man eat, unaware a tycoon was watching. Brian Thompson watched with disdain as other waiters rushed past the white-haired gentleman struggling to bring his fork to his mouth. It was his first month at the elegant restaurant The Monarch in New York City, and even knowing he could lose his job, he couldn't ignore the distressed look in the old man's eyes. Without hesitation, he approached the table and, without a word, gently took the fork from the man's trembling hands and offered him the pasta. What Brian didn't notice was the attentive gaze of businessman Richard Blackwell, owner of one of the largest construction companies in the country, who watched the scene from the next table with growing interest. "I'm sorry, but I noticed you were having trouble," Brian said softly, trying to preserve the customer's dignity. "No need to apologize, young man. My fingers don't obey like they used to," the man replied with a weary smile. "My name is Walter Jenkins, and I appreciate your kindness." Brian continued assisting Walter discreetly, while trying to tend to his other tables. The restaurant was packed that Friday night, and Kevin, the manager, was already shooting disapproving looks his way. "What do you think you're doing, Brian?" Kevin snapped, sidling up to him. "We have 20 more tables waiting, and you're playing nurse here." "The customer was struggling to eat, sir. I was just helping," Brian replied, keeping his composure. "His family should help him. Our job is to serve food, not spoon-feed it," Kevin retorted, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Walter lowered his gaze, visibly embarrassed. Brian's face burned with indignation, but he couldn't afford to lose this job. His mother, Mrs. Rose, relied on the medicine he bought with his paycheck, and the rent for their small apartment in Queens didn't forgive delays. "All right, sir," Brian murmured, reluctantly stepping away. From the next table, Richard Blackwell observed the scene while sipping his red wine. At 52, he had built a real estate empire, but something about that young waiter piqued his curiosity. Genuine compassion was rare these days, especially in New York City, where time was worth more than any emotion. In the weeks that followed, Walter became a regular at the restaurant, always requesting Brian's service. The young waiter, in turn, devised strategies to help the elderly man without drawing Kevin's attention, serving him during slower hours, seating him in less visible corners, and sometimes even asking other waiters to cover his tables so he could spend more time with Walter. "Son, you don't have to risk your job for me," Walter said one evening after noticing Brian had been scolded again. "Don't worry, Mr. Jenkins. My mother always said we should treat others the way we'd like to be treated," Brian replied, adjusting the wheelchair to make the old man more comfortable. Richard continued observing this unlikely friendship forming. Intrigued, he too became a regular, always requesting a table near Walter's, never interfering directly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing, one quiet afternoon when the restaurant was nearly empty, Walter finally shared his story with Brian. "I wasn't always like this, you know," he began, looking at his hands. "I was a doctor for 40 years, a neurologist, helped many people walk again." Brian listened attentively as he arranged the silverware on the table. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" "A car accident 3 years ago. I was coming back from a conference in Boston when a truck lost its brakes on the highway." Walter paused, taking a deep breath. "I lost movement from the waist down, and in a way I lost my family too." "What do you mean?" asked Brian, adjusting himself in the chair across from the older man. "My daughter, Jennifer. She's an executive at a multinational company. After the accident, she hired nurses, adapted my home, but she never has time to visit. I think it's hard for her to see her father, who was always strong, reduced to this." He pointed to the wheelchair. "At first she tried, but little by little she pulled away. Now I only see my daughter once a month when she checks if the nurses are taking good care of me." Brian felt a lump in his throat. He thought of his own mother, bedridden for 2 years because of rheumatoid arthritis. Even with all the difficulties, he'd never considered abandoning her. "And you, young man, how did you end up in this restaurant?" "I can see in your eyes you have bigger dreams," Walter remarked, changing the subject. "I always wanted to be a doctor, actually," Brian replied with a shy smile. "I studied for the entrance exams for 3 years while working during the day and finishing high school at night. I even got into medicine at the state university, but My father left us when I was 15. My mother got sick soon after. I had to choose between studying or working to take care of her. Brian shrugged. It wasn't a hard choice, really. She sacrificed everything for me my whole life. Walter reached out with a trembling hand and touched Brian's arm. You're a good man, Brian. Your dream isn't lost, just delayed. What neither of them knew was that, at a nearby table, Richard Blackwell had been listening to the whole conversation. Something in Brian's story and Walter's dignity struck the businessman deeply. Someone who had lost touch with his own humanity after years of corporate battles and ruthless negotiations. In the days that followed, Kevin intensified his harassment of Brian. Noticing the friendship that had formed between the waiter and the older man, the manager started scheduling Brian for shifts when Walter didn't usually visit the restaurant. On top of that, he assigned Brian the toughest tables and most demanding customers, hoping to see him fail. Brian, you're handling those 5 tables today, Kevin ordered, pointing to the busiest section of the restaurant. But sir, that's too many tables for one person, Brian argued. If you can't do your job, I can easily find someone who can, the manager retorted with a smug smile. As the weeks passed, Walter stopped coming to the restaurant. Worried, Brian even asked other regulars if they knew anything about the older man, but no one had any information. His concern grew when nearly a month went by without news. After much hesitation, Brian decided to ask for Walter's address from the restaurant's customer records. He knew it was against the rules, but his worry outweighed his fear of punishment. One Sunday afternoon, his only day off, Brian went to the address he'd written down, an apartment in a middle-class neighborhood on the Upper West Side of New York City. When he rang the bell, a tired-looking nurse answered. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping the door partially closed. "Good afternoon. My name is Brian. I'm a friend of Mr. Jenkins. He hasn't been coming to the restaurant where I work, and I got worried." The nurse sighed and opened the door wider. "He hasn't left the house in weeks. He's lost his spirit, barely eats. His daughter cut my hours to save money, so I only come 3 times a week now." Brian's heart ached. "Can I see him?" "Of course, any company will do him good." "Actually, I was just leaving. My shift ended half an hour ago, but I didn't want to leave you alone without dinner." The nurse led Brian to the room, where Walter was sitting in his wheelchair, staring blankly out the window. The apartment was spacious and well-decorated, but had an air of neglect. Dirty dishes in the sink, piled-up mail, and the smell of reheated food filled the space. "Mr. Jenkins?" Brian called softly. The elderly man turned slowly, and his eyes lit up when he recognized the young man. "Brian, what a wonderful surprise!" he exclaimed, his voice weak but genuinely happy. "I came to check on you. We were worried." "At the restaurant," Brian lied, not wanting to embarrass him. Walter smiled sadly. "I haven't had the energy to go out, and to be honest, I didn't like how that manager treated you because of me." Brian spent a few hours with Walter that afternoon. He helped him bathe, prepared a decent meal, and tidied up the apartment a bit. When he left, he promised to come back whenever he could. In the weeks that followed, Brian rearranged his routine. He woke up earlier to take care of his mother. Before work, used his lunch break to shop for Walter, and 3 times a week after his shift at the restaurant, he stopped by the old man's apartment to help him. The exhaustion was clear on his face, but Brian felt good about making a difference in someone's life. However, his new routine didn't go unnoticed. "You've been looking very tired lately," Kevin observed with false concern. "And you've been rushing off after your shift." "I have commitments, sir," Brian replied curtly. "I hope those commitments don't involve taking food from the restaurant," the manager insinuated. Brian's blood ran cold. On a few occasions, when he knew Walter hadn't eaten well, he had saved leftovers that were going to be thrown out to take to the old man. He never considered it stealing. It was food that would have been wasted. "I don't know what you're talking about," he answered, trying to stay calm. "We'll see," Kevin replied with a malicious smile. That night, hidden behind a pillar in the parking lot, Kevin took photos of Brian placing a small food container in his motorcycle's glove compartment. The next day, he called Brian into his office and showed him the pictures. "This is theft, Brian. You're fired. And be thankful I'm not calling the police." They were leftovers that were going in. The trash, Brian protested. I take them to a sick friend who can't cook for himself. Rules are rules. Clean out your locker and leave before lunch. With a heavy heart, Brian gathered his things. He desperately needed that job. How would he afford his mother's medicine now? How could he keep helping Walter? As he left the restaurant for the last time, he noticed Richard Blackwell entering. For a moment, their eyes met, but Brian was too wrapped up in his own problems to notice anything beyond his despair. In the weeks that followed, Brian's situation quickly deteriorated. He picked up odd jobs as a delivery driver for an app, but the income was unreliable and insufficient. To keep caring for Walter and his mother, he sold his small collection of medical books, which he had cherished for years, and even the watch his father had given him before abandoning the family. One evening, he arrived at Walter's apartment, looking particularly worn out. The dark circles under his eyes and weight loss were obvious. "Brian, you don't look well," Walter observed, concerned. "I'm fine, just a little tired," the young man lied as he prepared dinner in the small kitchen. "Sit down here," Walter said, pointing to the chair across from him. "You've already done so much for me today. We need to talk." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers tremendously. Now continuing. Brian obeyed, feeling the weight of exhaustion on his shoulders. "I know you lost your job because of me," Walter said bluntly. "The nurse told me she saw you leaving the restaurant with your things that day." Brian let out a deep sigh. "Say it wasn't your fault, Mr. Jenkins. Kevin never liked me. Even so, I feel responsible." Walter paused. "You mentioned your mother suffers from rheumatoid arthritis, correct?" Brian nodded, surprised the older man remembered that detail. "Before the accident, I specialized in that field. I spent decades researching alternative treatments for autoimmune diseases." Walter leaned forward in his wheelchair. "I'd like to meet your mother. Perhaps I can help her in some way." "You do? That?" Brian's eyes shone with hope for the first time in weeks. "It's the least I can do after all you've done for me." The next day, Brian took Walter to the small apartment where he lived with his mother. Mrs. Rose, a 58-year-old woman who looked much older due to her illness, greeted the retired doctor with the dignity of someone who, even sick, had never lost her pride. Walter examined Mrs. Rose with the care and expertise of decades of medical practice. In the end, he recommended simple exercises, dietary changes, and suggested cheaper alternative medications that would have the same effect as the expensive ones consuming nearly all of Brian's budget. "Your son is an extraordinary young man, Mrs. Rose," Walter remarked as Brian left them alone to prepare coffee. "He has the potential to be an excellent doctor." "That was always his dream," she replied with a sad smile. "But life had other plans for us. Perhaps not all is lost," Walter said thoughtfully. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Rose's health improved considerably under Walter's guidance. The exercises and new medication reduced her pain, allowing her to do simple household tasks for the first time in years. This eased some of Brian's burden, who could now search for a job with more determination. One afternoon, as he flipped through newspapers looking for job opportunities, Brian received an unexpected call. "Hello? Brian Thompson?" asked a male voice on the other end. "Yes, speaking. My name is Michael Stevenson, secretary to Mr. Richard Blackwell. He'd like to schedule an interview with you tomorrow, if possible." Brian was stunned. Richard Blackwell, the businessman who frequented the Monarch. An interview for what? "Mr. Blackwell is looking for a personal assistant and was impressed by your work at the restaurant. Would tomorrow at 10 a.m. at his office be convenient?" Not fully understanding what was happening but unable to turn down any job opportunity, Brian agreed. He spent the entire night pressing his only decent dress shirt and rehearsing possible answers to interview questions. The next day, he arrived at the headquarters of Blackwell Enterprises, an imposing building in New York City's financial district. He was escorted to the penthouse, where Richard awaited him in a spacious office with a panoramic view of the city. "Brian, thank you for coming," Richard said, standing to greet him. "Please have a seat." The young man sat nervously, feeling out of place in the luxurious surroundings. "Mr. Blackwell, I'll admit I'm confused. I don't recall us speaking at the restaurant." And we didn't, Richard confirmed with an enigmatic smile. But I observed your work for several weeks. Your dedication and integrity caught my attention. Brian blushed, unsure how to respond. Tell me about yourself, requested Richard, leaning back in his chair. With sincerity, Brian spoke about his sick mother, his deferred dream of studying medicine and the hardships he faced. He mentioned his friendship with Walter, unaware that Richard already knew every detail of that story. Impressive, the businessman remarked at the end of the account. How old are you, Brian? 22, sir. And you still want to be a doctor? It's my greatest dream, but I need to take care of my mother first. Richard stood and walked to the window, gazing at the city for a moment. I have a proposition for you, Brian. The Blackwell Foundation offers full scholarships to promising young individuals. I'm willing to grant you one that covers all expenses for medical school. Brian's eyes widened, unable to believe what he was hearing. But why? You barely know me. Let's just say I have good reasons, Richard replied with an enigmatic smile. However, there's one condition. What is it? Brian asked, already imagining it would be something impossible to fulfill. That condition will be revealed at the right time, Richard said. For now, I want you to think about my offer. Talk to your mother and give me an answer by the end of the week. Dazed by the unexpected proposal, Brian left the office feeling as if he were dreaming. On his way home, he decided to stop by Walter's apartment to share the unbelievable news. When he arrived, however, he found an unexpected scene. An elegant woman around 45 years old was arguing heatedly with Walter in the living room. Dad, don't be stubborn. This obsession of yours with independence is hurting you. You need to go to a specialized clinic. I'm not going anywhere, Jennifer. I'm fine here in my apartment with my things, Walter retorted, visibly upset. Brian hesitated at the door, unsure if he should interrupt. That's when Jennifer noticed him. Who are you? She asked suspiciously. This is Brian, the friend I mentioned, Walter replied quickly. Brian, this is my daughter, Jennifer. The woman narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing the young man from head to toe. So you're the one who's been coming here? The waiter? Her tone was clearly dismissive. Daddy, you barely know this boy. How can you trust him like this? Jennifer, don't be rude, Walter scolded. Brian has been more present in my life these past few months than you have in years. The woman crossed her arms, clearly irritated. Of course, now I'm the villain. While I work to pay for your expensive treatments, you open our home to strangers. Brian isn't a stranger, Walter defended. He's an opportunist, probably, Jennifer interrupted, turning to Brian. What do you want from my father? Money? The house? He's an old and vulnerable man, you know. Brian felt his face burn with indignation. With all due respect, ma'am, I want nothing from your father except his friendship. I came here because I care about him. Right, Jennifer smirked, sarcastically. And I suppose these frequent visits, the baths you give him, the groceries you buy, all of that is out of the pure kindness of your heart. Jennifer, enough! Walter's voice was firmer than Brian had ever heard. You have no right to speak that way to someone who's been doing what you should have done as a daughter. A heavy silence fell over the room. Jennifer blinked several times as if she'd been slapped. So that's it? You've found a replacement for me, a rented son? No, Jennifer. I found a friend when I needed one most. Something you'd never understand, because you're too busy counting the money you'll inherit when I'm gone. Brian felt extremely uncomfortable in the middle of this family argument. Maybe I should come back another day, he suggested, stepping back toward the door. No, stay, Walter urged. Jennifer was already on her way out. The woman grabbed her expensive leather purse from the couch and headed for the door. This isn't over, Dad. I'm talking to my lawyer. You're clearly in no condition to make decisions for yourself. When Jennifer left, slamming the door behind her, Walter let out a tired sigh. I'm sorry about that, Brian. My daughter wasn't always like this. The corporate world changed her. Brian stepped closer and placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. It's all right, Mr. Jenkins. Family can be complicated sometimes. She thinks you're manipulating me to get my money, Walter said, sadly. As if I even had that much left. Most of what I have goes toward treatments and keeping this apartment. I don't care what she thinks, Brian replied sincerely. I'm here because I like you, and because you've taught me more about medicine in these past few months than I ever learned from books." Walter smiled gratefully, but the smile quickly faded. "I'm afraid of what Jennifer might do. She has connections, power. If she decides I'm incompetent, she could get me declared legally unfit." Brian felt a tightness in his chest. He hadn't considered that possibility. "Do you really think she'd do that?" "To protect me, yes, she would." Walter stared out the window, lost in thought. "And the worst part is, legally, she'd have a case. I'm a paralyzed old man who gets regular visits from a young man I barely know. To many judges, that alone would raise suspicions." Brian didn't know what to say. He was so worried about Walter's situation that he'd almost forgotten to mention Richard Blackwell's offer. In the days that followed, Brian continued visiting Walter, but now with an added weight of concern. At the same time, Richard's proposal lingered in his mind. An opportunity like that wouldn't come again, but something about the businessman's mysterious behavior left him uneasy. On Friday, the deadline Richard had given him, Brian returned to Blackwell Enterprises. "So, Brian, what's your answer?" Richard asked as soon as the young man entered his office. "Before I answer, Mr. Blackwell, I need to know why you're doing this. What do you get out of helping someone like me?" Richard smiled, appreciating the young man's honesty. "Let's just say I'm investing in potential. You have something rare these days. Character." He paused. "As for my condition, it's simple. I want you to keep looking after Dr. Walter Jenkins while you study." Brian's eyes widened in surprise. "How do you know about Mr. Jenkins?" Richard stood and walked closer to Brian. "I've known Walter longer than you'd think. In fact, we have quite a history together." Before he could elaborate, the office door swung open abruptly. Jennifer, Walter's daughter, stormed in like a hurricane, followed by a man in a suit who appeared to be her lawyer. "Richard Blackwell. So you're behind all this," she exclaimed furiously. "Jennifer, still barging into places uninvited, I see," Richard replied calmly. "Some things never change." Brian looked back and forth between them, confused. "You two know each other?" "Oh, we do," Jennifer answered bitterly. "Richard was my father's partner at the clinic, until he betrayed him and took everything from him." "That's your version of the story," Richard countered. "Always so melodramatic." "What's going on here?" Brian asked, feeling completely lost. Richard took a deep breath. "Brian, I think it's time you heard the whole story. Everyone, please sit." Jennifer reluctantly took a seat, while her lawyer remained standing behind her. Brian sat as well, anxious to understand the confusing situation. "Walter and I were partners and friends for over 30 years, and Richard began. Together, we founded the Jenkins and Blackwell Neurological Center, which became a benchmark for innovative treatments of neurological and autoimmune diseases." Brian listened intently, trying to absorb every word. 15 years ago, we developed a revolutionary treatment technique. Walter wanted to make it freely available, while I believed we should patent it. That was our first major disagreement. "You didn't just want to patent it," Jennifer interrupted. "You wanted to sell the technique to a pharmaceutical multinational for millions. And your father wanted to give it away, ignoring the decades of investment we'd made," Richard countered. "But that's only part of the story." Richard walked to the window, gazing at the city for a moment before continuing. "When Jennifer graduated with a business degree, Walter wanted to bring her into the center. I opposed it, not because I didn't trust you, Jennifer, but because I saw how your father changed his values to impress you." "That's ridiculous," she protested. "Is it?" Richard turned to face her. "Your father, who always advocated for universal health care, suddenly started talking about expansion, attracting high-income patients, increasing profit margins, all to prove to you that he could be a businessman too." Jennifer opened her mouth to argue, but Richard pressed on. "Our partnership ended when I decided to leave the center. I sold my share to Walter for a symbolic amount and switched industries. I went into real estate, where I wouldn't have to compromise my ethical principles." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now, back to the story. "You say that as if you're some kind of saint," Jennifer scoffed. "The great Richard Blackwell, the man of principles. But it was after you left that the center truly flourished. My father turned that small practice into the largest neurological center in the United States. Yes, he did, Richard surprisingly agreed. And he paid a terrible price for it. What are you talking about? Walter sacrificed everything for the center. His marriage, his health, even his relationship with you, Jennifer. Richard looked directly at her. How many birthdays, school events, important moments of your life did he miss because he was too busy expanding the empire he built to impress you? Jennifer averted her gaze, visibly uncomfortable. And why exactly were you at that restaurant watching my father? She asked, changing the subject. Coincidence at first. I saw Walter there and was surprised we hadn't spoken in years, but then I noticed how all the waiters passed by him, ignoring his struggle, until Brian stepped in. Richard gave the young man an approving look. I saw in him the same spirit I once admired in your father, Jennifer, that genuine compassion Walter had before he got lost in the corporate world. And now you want to use this waiter to get close to my father again? Is that it? Jennifer asked suspiciously. No, Jennifer. I want to give Brian the opportunity your father never had, to follow his calling without sacrificing his principles. Brian, who had been silently watching the exchange, finally spoke up. With all due respect, I still don't understand what any of this has to do with me. If you have issues to settle, you should take them up with Mr. Jenkins directly. Richard turned to Brian with admiration. You're right. That's exactly why I invited Walter to join us. As if on cue, the office door opened again. Michael, the secretary, entered, pushing Walter's wheelchair. Dad! Jennifer exclaimed in surprise. Walter, old friend, Richard greeted, stepping forward to shake the elderly man's hand. Richard. Walter returned the handshake with his trembling hands. It's been so long. Too long, Richard agreed. It took this extraordinary young man to bring us back together. Walter looked at Brian with affection. What's going on here, huh? He asked, noticing the tension in the room. We're trying to resolve a decades-old misunderstanding, Walter, and also deciding the future of this remarkable young man. Brian? Walter looked confused at the young man. Mr. Blackwell offered to pay for my medical school, Brian explained. But it seems there's much more to this story than I realized. Walter turned to Richard, surprised. You'd do that for him? I would. On one condition, that he continues to care for you while he studies. Richard paused. And that you, stubborn old man, accept my help too. Your help? Walter asked skeptically. I want to renovate your apartment to make it more accessible. Hire full-time nurses, give you the comfort and dignity you deserve. Jennifer stepped between the two men. And why would we do that? Why should we trust you after everything? Because, unlike you, Jennifer, Richard is here, Walter replied firmly. Because he saw something in Brian that you overlooked. Character. And because, after all these years, he still cares. Jennifer stepped back, visibly shaken by her father's words. But Dad, you always said he betrayed you. I've said many things over the years, daughter. Things I'm not proud of. Walter took a deep breath. The truth is, I was the one who betrayed our principles. Richard simply refused to follow the same path. A heavy silence fell over the room. Brian looked from one face to another, trying to understand the complexity of the family and professional history unfolding before him. What happened to the clinic? He finally asked. Walter lowered his head, ashamed. It went bankrupt 2 years before my accident. We expanded too much, took on unpayable debts. In the end, we had to sell everything to an international conglomerate. And all our work, our research, that technique you wanted to make freely available, Richard continued, all patented and available only to those who can pay a fortune, Walter finished bitterly. Exactly what you feared would happen. Jennifer seemed genuinely surprised. Dad, you never told me this. You always said you sold the clinic for a good offer. Because I was ashamed, Jennifer. Ashamed to admit I failed, that I lost. Everything. Walter looked at his daughter sadly. You always admired me for being a winner. How could I tell you that in the end? Richard was right. Jennifer's lawyer, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, leaned in to whisper something in her ear. She nodded and stood up. I need to process all this. She looked at her father, then at Richard, and finally at Brian. I don't know what to think now. Think about what's best for your father, Jennifer, Richard said gently. Not the past, not the money, but what he truly needs now. Jennifer didn't respond. She gestured to her lawyer, and they both left the office, leaving Walter, Richard, and Brian alone. She'll be back, Walter said with a tired sigh. Jennifer is stubborn, but she's not a bad person. She's just lost. Like we all were at some point, Richard remarked. Now let's get to the point. He turned to Brian. My offer still stands. The scholarship for medical school, the support for Walter, everything. But now you know the full story. What do you say? Brian looked at the elderly man who had become his friend, then at the businessman who, surprisingly, seemed genuine in his proposal. Why me? He asked simply. There must be hundreds of more qualified young people with better grades, more experience. Tired because you did what none of us could do, replied Richard. You looked beyond appearances, beyond social status. You saw the person, not the patient or the client. It's rare these days, added Walter, especially in medicine. Brian felt the weight of responsibility, but also a growing sense of hope. If I accept, I have one condition too, he said with a confidence he didn't know he had. What? Asked Richard, intrigued. That you and Mr. Walter resolve your differences. For real. Not just for my sake or because of the scholarship, but because life's too short to hold grudges. The two older men exchanged surprised glances, then smiled. This kid, Walter remarked, shaking his head. He's going to be an excellent doctor, Richard finished. We have a deal, Brian. In the weeks that followed, many changes took place. Walter's apartment was completely renovated to meet his needs. New nurses were hired and a health monitoring system was installed. Brian began the process of enrolling in medical school for the next semester. One afternoon, as Brian studied for his admissions exams in the new office set up in Walter's apartment, the doorbell rang. To his surprise, it was Jennifer. Brian, can I come in? She asked, her expression far from the arrogance she'd shown before. Of course, your father's resting, but I can wake him. Actually, I came to talk to you first, she said, stepping hesitantly inside. Wow, this place is unrecognizable. Yes, Mr. Blackwell didn't hold back on the renovations, Brian commented. Typical of him, Jennifer murmured, but without her earlier hostility. Brian, I came to apologize for how I treated you, for the things I said. The sincerity in her voice took him aback. You don't have to apologize. You were protecting your father. No, I was protecting myself, she corrected, sitting on the couch. From the guilt of neglecting him, from the shame of not being the daughter he deserved. It was easier to accuse him of being manipulated than to admit my own failure, Brian. Didn't know how to respond to such honesty. I've talked a lot with Richard these past weeks, Jennifer continued. He told me things about my father I never knew, about the sacrifices he made for me, how he shaped his whole life around my future. Tears welled in her eyes. You know what's worse? When I was little, all I wanted was time with my dad. I didn't care if we were rich or not. I just wanted him at my ballet recitals, my birthday parties. She wiped a tear away. And now, when I could finally repay him for everything, I abandoned him when he needed me most. It's never too late to start over, Brian said gently. Your father loves you deeply. He talks about you all the time. Jennifer looked at him with gratitude. Thank you for taking care of him when I couldn't, or rather when I wouldn't. She took a deep breath. I requested leave from work. 3 months. I want to spend that time getting to know my father again, being the daughter he deserves. He'll be so happy, Brian replied with a warm smile. And as for you, Jennifer hesitated. Richard told me about the scholarship, the agreement. I hope you know I don't plan to push you away from my father. He needs us both. Just then the bedroom door opened slowly, and Walter appeared in his wheelchair. Jennifer, he called, surprised and emotional at the sight of his daughter. Dad! She stood quickly and rushed to him, kneeling beside the chair to embrace him. Forgive me. Please, forgive me. Walter held his daughter, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. There's nothing to forgive, my girl, nothing at all. Brian watched the reconciliation with a full heart. Discreetly, he headed for the door to give them privacy. "Where are you going, Brian?" asked Walter, noticing his exit. "I thought you might need some time alone." "No, stay," Jennifer requested, reaching out her hand to him. "You're part of this family now." Family. A word Brian had nearly forgotten the meaning of beyond his mother. Now, suddenly, he found himself part of something bigger. Something that had begun with a simple act of kindness in an upscale restaurant. The following months brought intense changes. Brian began his medical studies, dividing his time between the state university, caring for his mother, who now also received special attention from nurses hired by Richard, and visits to Walter, which became more social and less care-focused as the older man regained his independence. Jennifer kept her promise to take a leave from work and started visiting her father's apartment daily. Together, father and daughter began reconnecting. She listened intently to stories about the early days of the clinic, the ideals that had driven Walter at the start of his career, before ambition and the desire to impress her had led him astray. Richard also became a constant presence. The two old friends rebuilt their friendship, now stronger and wiser, tempered by the years and the experiences that had separated them. Together, they began planning a non-profit foundation dedicated to making advanced neurological treatments accessible to low-income patients, finally realizing the dream they had shared decades earlier. On a sunny afternoon, 6 months after that transformative meeting in Richard's office, the four gathered for lunch at the Monarch. The restaurant had undergone changes too. Kevin, the tyrannical manager, had been replaced after multiple reports of workplace harassment. The new manager, a young and empathetic man, had completely transformed the work environment. "I never thought I'd come back to this place," Brian remarked, looking around nostalgically. "The tables are the same, but everything feels different, doesn't it?" observed Walter, who now used a motorized wheelchair that gave him much more independence. "Context changes everything," Richard said, raising his wineglass. A toast to new beginnings and old friendships. Everyone raised their glasses, including Jennifer, who seemed more relaxed and happy than Brian had ever seen her. "You know, Brian," Walter began, contemplating the wine in his glass, "I remember the day I met Richard. It was 1975. I was a young, idealistic doctor, fresh out of school, wanting to change the world. And I was a business student who thought I knew everything," Richard added with a nostalgic smile. "We met at a public health conference in Chicago. We argued all night," Walter recalled, chuckling softly. "I was advocating for a stronger public health care system, and he insisted there'd be no innovation without private enterprise." Brian listened, fascinated by this trip into the past, watching the two men's eyes light up with shared memories. "In the end, we realized we agreed more than we disagreed," Richard continued. "We both wanted advanced treatments to be accessible to everyone. We just differed on the path." 2 years later, we opened our first clinic, Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "A tiny practice in downtown New York City. We barely had enough for rent. But we had passion," Richard added, "and patients who believed in us. And now from this rebuilt friendship," Walter paused dramatically, looking at Jennifer. "And to departments," she added with a smile. "Dad, Richard, should I tell them, or will you?" Walter and Richard exchanged knowing glances. "You can tell them, sweetheart." Jennifer turned to Brian, excited. The Jenkins Blackwell Foundation for Healthcare Accessibility was officially registered yesterday. And guess what? We're creating a research department in geriatrics and limited mobility. We want you to lead it after you graduate. Brian choked on his wine. "Me? But it'll take years for me to graduate, complete my residency." "That's exactly why we're planning now," Richard explained. "We want to build the department around your vision, your ideas. You already have more hands-on experience with patients like Walter than many licensed doctors." Jennifer opened her purse and pulled out a folder with the Foundation's newly designed logo. "Our legal team is already working on the bylaws. We want the Foundation to stand on 3 pillars: accessible research, low-cost treatments, and humanized training for new doctors. And that last pillar is where you fit perfectly," Richard added. "We want to create a scholarship program for medical students who show not just academic excellence, but genuine compassion." Brian Thompson Scholars, Walter said proudly. Young people like you, who understand medicine, goes far beyond diagnoses and procedures. Brian felt a lump in his throat. He who never imagined he could even study medicine now had his name tied to a scholarship program for other dreamers. There's more, Jennifer continued, pulling another document from the folder. We're negotiating to buy land near the university campus. It'll be the Foundation's headquarters and the future research center. All this because of some pasta, Brian joked, referring to that first act of helping Walter eat. The four laughed, but there was deep truth in that remark. How small gestures could trigger immense transformations. I don't know what to say. Brian was genuinely moved. Say you accept, Walter urged, placing his trembling hand over the young man's. Say you'll help other stubborn old folks like me live with dignity. Brian looked at the three faces before him. Walter, who had become a mentor and second father. Richard, whose generosity had completely changed his life's course. And Jennifer, who had gone from adversary to ally and friend. He also thought of his mother, whose health improved daily thanks to treatments they once couldn't afford. He remembered the day he received his medical school acceptance letter years ago. How he'd cried realizing he'd have to decline because his mother needed him. That night, Mrs. Rose had noticed his gloom. What's wrong, son? You look like you lost a treasure, she'd asked, despite the constant pain she endured. It's nothing, Mom. Just tired, he replied, hiding the letter. But Mrs. Rose, with that intuition only mothers have, insisted until he confessed. He'd been accepted to the State University for Medicine, but couldn't attend. Why not? She asked, genuinely confused. Because I need to work to take care of you, Mum. What followed was forever etched in Brian's memory. Mrs. Rose, despite her pain, rose from bed with dignity. Listen well, Brian Thompson, she said firmly. I didn't raise my son to be my crutch. I raised a man to fly, to chase his dreams. But, Mom, your medicine, the rent... We'll figure it out, she insisted, even knowing they couldn't. I've worked since I was 12, so you could study. I won't let you give up now. In the end, reality had defeated the dream. Brian declined the offer and doubled down on finding work. But what Mrs. Rose said that day planted in him a seed of determination that never died. And now, years later, that seed was finally blooming. I accept, he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. I accept with all my heart, but with one additional condition. The three looked at him surprised. I want the first floor of the center to be dedicated to treating autoimmune diseases in low-income women, and I want it to be called the Margaret Thompson Wing. It was Walter's turn to be moved. Your mother deserves this tribute, Brian. She raised an extraordinary son. As they enjoyed their meal, chatting animatedly about future plans, Brian noticed at a distant table a young waiter discreetly helping an elderly woman cut her meat. The waiter glanced around, just as Brian had done so many times, checking if any supervisor was watching. With a smile, Brian gave the waiter a small nod of approval, which the young man returned with a subtle gesture. The cycle continued. Compassion, passing from one person to another, creating an invisible chain of kindness. Did you see that waiter? Brian asked quietly. They all looked in the direction he indicated. He reminds me of you, 6 months ago, Jennifer remarked. Exactly what I was thinking, Richard agreed. We should invite him to join our scholarship program. Easy now, let's take it slow, Walter cautioned with a laugh. You've barely started the foundation, and already you want to recruit the whole city. The four laughed, but Walter's comment made Brian reflect. Actually, Mr. Jenkins, I think you're right. Even if you were joking about recruiting the whole city. Brian straightened in his chair, his expression turning more serious. What worries me is that no matter how big our foundation grows, we'll always be a drop in the ocean. For every person we help, thousands will still lack access to proper care. Richard nodded, understanding Brian's concern. That's why education is so important, he said. We might treat a few hundred patients a year, but if we train dozens of doctors with the same compassionate vision, the impact will multiply. What if we push for policy changes too? Jennifer added, surprising everyone. With the influence we could advocate for more public funding for senior care. Jennifer Jenkins championing social causes, Walter teased, looking at his daughter with pride. Who would have thought? I learned from the best, Dad, she replied, squeezing his hand affectionately. At that moment, Brian understood something profound. Sometimes the simplest gesture, like helping someone eat, can spark transformations we can't even imagine. And maybe that's what truly matters. Not grand achievements or recognition, but the small acts of kindness that, like seeds, bloom when we least expect. You know what amazes me most about all this, Brian said, looking at Walter. How you turned your own suffering into something positive. Many in your place would have given in to bitterness. Walter was silent for a moment, his eyes glistening. There were times I almost did, Brian, especially in those first months after the accident. He paused, taking a deep breath. I, who spent my life helping people regain movement, suddenly couldn't even lift a fork to my mouth without help. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Dad, we never talked about this, Jennifer said softly, realizing her father was opening up in a way he rarely did. Because it was too painful, sweetheart. Walter held her hand. I'd built my whole identity around my profession, my independence. Losing that felt like losing myself. How did you overcome it? Richard asked with genuine interest. Walter looked directly at Brian. It was when this young man served me with dignity, no pity, no condescension. For the first time since the accident, someone treated me like a whole person, not as a problem to be solved or ignored. The road to Brian's graduation wasn't easy. During his 5 years at university, there were moments of crisis that tested everyone's determination and commitment. In his 3rd year, Mrs. Rose suffered a severe relapse. Her joints became inflamed. Again, and this time, even the treatments recommended by Walter seemed ineffective. Brian nearly dropped out to care for his mother full-time, but she was the one who stopped him. Don't even think about it, my son, Mrs. Rose said from her hospital bed. You're less than 2 years away from achieving your dream, our dream. What's the point of becoming a doctor if I can't even help my own mother? Brian asked, holding the fragile hand of the woman who had raised him alone. You're already helping me more than you realize, she replied with a weak smile. Every time I see you come home with those heavy books, excitedly telling me what you've learned, I feel it's all been worth it. Walter, who was closely monitoring her case, suggested an experimental treatment being developed at the foundation. It's risky, he explained to Brian and Mrs. Rose, but I've seen promising results in patients with similar conditions. If you trust it, Dr. Jenkins, then so do I, Mrs. Rose replied calmly. The treatment was a success. Within 3 months, Mrs. Rose not only recovered, but showed significant improvement in her mobility. This episode brought the two families even closer. During this same period, the foundation faced its own challenges. A group of healthcare investors, troubled by the proposal for affordable treatments that could cut into their profits, tried to sabotage the project. They questioned permits, spread rumors about the quality of care, and even offered Jennifer a lucrative position at one of their companies, hoping to create another rift in the family. It was Richard who spotted the maneuver. It's the same old game, he explained during an emergency meeting at the foundation. They want to divide us to weaken us. It won't work this time, Jennifer said firmly. I've learned my lesson. Some things are more important than money or power. To everyone's surprise, it was Walter who proposed the solution. Let's invite them to be partners, not opponents. Partners? Brian questioned. But they represent everything we're fighting against. Exactly why, Walter replied with a wise smile. Sometimes the best way to change a system isn't by fighting it, but by transforming it from within. The strategy worked. In a series of meetings skillfully led by Richard and Jennifer, the investors realized there was a viable business model in the foundation's proposal. Affordable, high-quality treatments supported by cutting-edge research and compassionate training. It's a new paradigm, Richard explained in one meeting. We're not proposing charity, we're proposing efficiency. Early accessible treatments cost the system less overall than late-stage complications. Gradually, initial resistance turned into genuine interest. Some investors became key supporters, expanding the foundation's reach beyond what they'd initially imagined. Throughout this process, Brian divided his time between his intensive medical studies, caring for his mother, now significantly better, and his growing involvement in the foundation's activities. In his rare free moments, Brian still found time to visit Walter, no longer as a caregiver but as a friend and apprentice. They were difficult times but profoundly transformative. Brian didn't just learn medicine from books and labs. He lived the practical application of care, compassion and perseverance that would define his career. Finally, the big day arrived. At an emotional ceremony, Brian received his medical degree. In the audience, applauding proudly, were his mother, now able to walk with the aid of a cane, Walter with tears in his eyes, Richard with his restrained but genuine smile, and Jennifer, who had become one of the strongest advocates for the foundation, having reduced her corporate workload to dedicate more time to the cause her father had started. When his name was called, the entire auditorium gave him a standing ovation, not just for the new doctor graduating, but for the inspiring story many there knew. The waiter who helped a paraplegic elderly man and turned that simple gesture into a calling. As he stepped off the stage with his diploma, Brian went straight to embrace his mother. "We did it, Mom," he murmured, tears in his eyes. "No, son," corrected Mrs. Rose, equally moved. "You did it. I just believed in you." A month after graduation, they inaugurated the Research Center for Senior Mobility and Independence, a modern, welcoming facility led by Dr. Brian Thompson. The building, designed by one of the country's top architects, a personal friend of Richard's, stood out not just for its beauty but for its functionality. Every detail had been carefully planned to offer dignity and independence to patients. Strategically placed handrails, gently sloping ramps, automatic doors, accessible bathrooms, and a staff trained to treat each person with the same respect and attention Brian had shown Walter that first night at the restaurant. At the inauguration, Jennifer surprised everyone with a special gift, an entire wing dedicated to innovative treatments for arthritis and other joint conditions, named the Margaret Thompson Wing. Mrs. Rose, who had no idea, burst into tears when she saw her name on the plaque. "Why?" she asked Jennifer, confused by the honor. "I didn't do anything to deserve this." "You raised Brian," Jennifer replied simply, "and without him none of this would exist." The first day of appointments was scheduled for the following week, but one person in particular couldn't wait, a former restaurant manager named Kevin, who had suffered a stroke and was left partially paralyzed with no means for proper treatment. When Kevin recognized Brian, his eyes widened in shock and shame. "Dr. Thompson, I didn't know. I'm sorry for everything." Brian just smiled, gently adjusting the former manager's wheelchair. "Don't worry, Mr. Kevin. Here, everyone gets the same treatment. The treatment every person deserves, with dignity and respect." In the months that followed, the center thrived beyond expectations. Patients from all walks of life were welcomed with the same care and attention. The treatment results became a national benchmark, attracting visits from doctors and researchers across the country. The scholarship program also took off. Talented, compassionate young people, many from backgrounds as challenging as Brian's, received the opportunity he had nearly missed, studying medicine without sacrificing their values or abandoning their families. One afternoon, while working, in his office, Brian received an unexpected visitor. "Dr. Thompson, there's someone here to see you," his assistant announced. "Says he's an old friend." To his surprise, it was the young waiter he had observed at the restaurant years ago, helping the elderly woman. "Remember me?" the young man asked nervously. "My name is Jason. We met at the Monarch a few years back." "Of course I remember," Brian replied, inviting him to sit. "How can I help you?" "Actually, I came to thank you." Jason seemed emotional. "After that day, you and the white-haired gentleman came back to the restaurant a few times. You always treated me with respect, talked to me." Brian smiled, remembering the visits with Walter. "One day you left an envelope for me," Jason continued. "It had a flyer about the Foundation's scholarship program and a letter encouraging me to apply." "That was Mr. Jenkins' idea," Brian admitted. "He said he saw in you the same thing he saw in me." "Well, I applied." Jason broke into a radiant smile. "And I got accepted. I start medical school next semester. I wanted you to know that in person." Brian stood up and hugged the young man, genuinely happy for him. "Welcome to the family, Jason." And as he walked through the center's halls later that day, guiding Kevin, who was now receiving regular treatment and showing significant improvement, to his physical therapy session, Brian thought about life's twists and turns, how a simple act of compassion had set off a chain of events that transformed not only his own life, but so many others. On the main plaque in the reception area, a highlighted phrase summed up the center's philosophy and the lesson Brian had learned that night at the restaurant. True greatness lies in the small acts of kindness. End of story. Dear listener, who would have thought a simple act of kindness could change so many lives? And you, have you done an act of kindness today? Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments if this story touched your heart. Your company is our greatest gift.